Welcome to episode 6 of the Sustainable Tech Partner Podcast, hosted by Joe Panettieri. Today's guest is Professor Ayman Omar, a sustainability expert and researcher from American University's Kogod School of Business. We discuss the recent carbon-neutral Apple Watch announcement, and we explore whether Apple and the overall tech industry are making progress with sustainability efforts across their supply chains. Professor Omar, great to see you.
Thank you, Joe. It's nice to be here.
I appreciate you carving out some time for us. When Apple made the Apple Watch carbon neutrality announcement, it certainly caught my attention. And then your team was kind enough to say, hey, we have more insights this year. Professor Omar would really love to get into this with you. So thank you. I really do appreciate you providing more context here. But before we get into the Apple discussion, let's start with you and a little bit about your research background. Tell our viewers who may not be familiar with you what you're up to.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I work at the Kogod School of Business as a faculty member focused on supply chain management. I've been working in supply chain management now for almost, next year will be 20 years in that space. And one of the areas I focus on my research and examination and working with organizations is global sustainability or sustainability in global supply chains. How do you become more sustainable? And how do you work with your global suppliers, with your global network to become more sustainable? And you're only as sustainable as your entire network. It's hard to make that claim on your own of saying, I'm sustainable, but my suppliers are not. So how do you work? How do you manage that very complicated web of intermediaries and suppliers and distributors and everybody who's involved as part of this process? And how do you improve on that sustainability continuum? And I think as we talk about sustainability, we'll always have to consider this as a continuum. It's not a binary. It's not a 1 or 0. Are you sustainable or are you not sustainable? It's a continuum. And I think the goal is for us to keep moving forward and improving and enhancing on sustainability along that continuum. Some organizations are slightly more advanced than others, but I think it's very common to see a lot of struggles. And I think the situation of where we are now is very different than we were 10 years ago. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done on all fronts, whether it's organizations, governments, policymakers, us as consumers, just the entire ecosystem.
Yeah, no doubt. Plenty more work to be done. I'm curious, you've done sustainability research at length now, but let's pull back. You've done supply chain research at length. I'm wondering, was there a moment in time when your supply chain research began to focus on sustainability, or did it always focus on sustainability? Was it always part of it? Or was there an aha moment where you said, we need to get into the sustainability portion of this?
I think, thank you for that question. I think it evolved over time. So I didn't start off my career looking at sustainability, but over time, it's an area where it was interesting for me personally. And I think there were 2 aha moments. I think the first aha moment was, historically, we've always looked at sustainability as from just one aspect of this, which was the environment. And the approach was always, how do you improve things to be better for the environment, which is absolutely a must. But we never thought of this as, that actually being good for the environment is an actual good business practice, that it's actually, they're not mutually exclusive. It's not a false choice of an or. And a big part of managing supply chains really comes to the heart of being more efficient. How are you more efficient? How do you reduce waste in your supply chain? How do you reduce returns in your supply chain? And when you think about all of those practices, they're integrally connected to reducing emissions, reducing waste, reducing material that's being used, more recycling, remanufacturing, refurbishment. So over time, it evolved to align both of those areas of seeing they're actually matching. And the second aha moment was when I first started working on this, I said, okay, let's examine the best-in-class organizations, the exemplars of who's doing what in that space, and started doing a qualitative interview process, just like the one we're doing right now. And started talking to heads of supply chains in different organizations. And after a decent number of interviews, it hit us that every single company we're talking to is struggling. And that's the actual question we should have been asking is, it's not what are you great at doing in terms of sustainability? It's like, why are you struggling to advance some of those sustainability initiatives? And we saw many different reasons and many different aspects. So it's not a one size fits all for all companies, but that's where we really realized the overwhelming majority of organizations, even those who are really trying to push forward on that, are struggling for different reasons. And I think the key area here to advance that is figuring out why are organizations struggling and how do you close that gap to make sure that they can advance on different fronts. And again, it wasn't just a one reason or one issue across all organizations. They were different, and we had like 4 different even clusters or 4 different segments of categorizing those areas or those struggles and issues. But that was the second aha moment in terms of there's so much to be done, and this is an area that really warrants a closer look and a closer advancement on all fronts again. And I think that was my second aha moment of being in that space.
Fantastic. Speaking of aha moments, it's a perfect segue because, my personal belief is, well, first of all, you and I are speaking on October 12th, 2023, roughly 2 weeks, give or take, after the Apple carbon neutral Apple Watch was announced. And for me, I consider it an aha moment, both for the believers who say, yeah, wow, that's great. That's a sustainable product, right? And then for the non-believers who may have said, well, wait a minute, does the math really work? Can Apple back up these claims of a carbon neutral watch? I thought at least it got both sides talking about what it means to develop a carbon neutral product. So that being the case from my vantage point, what about your vantage point? In terms of the data points that Apple shared in that announcement, do you think it's accurate to call specific models of the Apple Watch carbon neutral, or are they perhaps stretching or bending the truth here?
Yeah, I'd say yes and no. I'd say yes, because what they mentioned in terms of moving to some facilities with like using electricity for production, shifting a little bit of their transportation modes from air to sea, shifting some of the materials, looking at different aspects of this. Sure, that's helping. But of course, there's the carbon credits aspect of the equation. And the question is how much of the carbon credits are really helping as much as we think they are or not. So that's the part of it. So you can't say they've been lying about this, but I think we'll need to step back and look at the bigger picture, which is from a volume standpoint, how much are the watches and other accessories, how much do they represent as part of Apple's portfolio?
Right.
And that's 10 to 15%. So even if we think about that, sure, that's even if we all agree that this is a carbon neutral product. But that's really just a very small, tiny segment. And I'm not saying it's easy to achieve that. It could be complicated. It depends on the strategy internally from Apple, whether it's starting with something that's very small and maybe trying to expand it to a larger portfolio of products. But the real advancement would be looking at those products. If you look at the iPhones, iPad, you combine iPhones and iPads, that's almost 50% of their sales. That's really where the bulk of it is. Yeah. And that's where the impact is. Not taking away this from Apple to say, they're not doing anything. They are doing definitely better. They're slightly more advanced than many other companies. They've got the resources to advance. But I think we should take it into context in terms of what have they achieved and what are the next steps. I think Apple also is a great marketing organization, and they use those many steps to advance sustainability initiatives to really paint a picture on a broader spectrum and really attract customers to say that the products are more sustainable. So I'm more aligned with Apple and I feel better about buying those products from Apple. I think each approach is not wrong. I think there has to be just more education from the general customer base and population in terms of the complexity of the process, because it's not something where you can just turn on or off a switch and say, okay, we're going to be sustainable tomorrow or not. It's very complicated, and it's not easy for any company. And we have to be honest with ourselves that it's a very, very complicated, because one part of the complication is we look at supply chains in a linear fashion of there's a box, an arrow to another box, an arrow to a third box, it's a supplier to a manufacturer to a customer. And it's nothing even close to this. It's a very, interconnected web of different nodes connected to each other in a very, very complex manner that you look at a visual of a supply chain and you start getting a headache in less than 2 seconds just by looking at that. And really to be sustainable, to our earlier point is if you want to be sustainable, your supply chain has to be sustainable as well. And you have to have those measures in place and metrics in place, and you have to have folks on board and so on. Maybe starting with a low-hanging fruit could be one of the steps to advance to there and maybe expand beyond that, as long as there is a plan to expand beyond that. That's the first part of the answer to it. Second part is, are we better off going with one product versus the entire process? So, for example, if we look at one aspect of Apple's portfolio of products, just the watch, is that better for us or having a more impact, or should we actually look at the entire process across all products, process of transportation, the process of distribution, the process of being closer to customers, the process of recycling, refurbishment, remanufacturing, cutting across all portfolios? Should we look at this by process, or should we look at this as a vertical by product? It's easier for customers and it's easier for Apple to market that based on a product, because for me, it's easier to think of product X is sustainable, as opposed to saying their transportation system is more sustainable. For me, it's just very confusing. Even the impact could be even much more in that space. So I think that's where it is. So I think there's two sides of that story. I think it's a very complicated aspect, but I think at least now we understand that people are really paying attention, that Apple is paying attention. This is a concern. And I think sooner or later, if you can market a few things at a low scale or a small scale, but eventually people will hold you accountable to the larger picture, especially if the consumer base is concerned about sustainability. And I think that's the other aspect of this equation is, as consumers, are we pushing companies to move along that continuum or not? Because that's going to be their number one driver, in addition, of course, to policy and regulation. But that's the number one driver to move into that space and be proactive about it, as opposed to just checking the box or having some kind of greenwashing activities.
Yeah. So I have a bunch of follow-up questions. Some of it involves the consumer. Some of it involves the broader Apple, which you accurately point out. This really is, we should focus on the broader Apple in this discussion. But I do want to first zero back in on the actual Apple Watch for a second before we zoom out on the broader Apple. That Apple Watch announcement, I forget the exact figures, correct me if I'm wrong. Did they mention that, hey, like we're 70% of the way there in carbon neutrality, and maybe 25 or 30% involves carbon credits at the end of the day? I think that was sort of the gist of it. And do you think that's enough, or do we need to get away from carbon credits being part of the sustainability conversation?
I think eventually, so in terms of the numbers, I think you're correct about something similar to those numbers, more or less. Are those accurate numbers? I'll take them at their face value. I have no reason to suspect that there is any misleading in terms of the numbers not being correct. But I think, to your point, the carbon credits, I think eventually we'll have to get rid of that, or find solutions to that to counter the carbon credits. Because what's a sustainable aspect? Is it 70-30? Is it 20-80? So if I do 100% carbon credits, is that enough and I'm not being sustainable in my operations? Or how do you deal with it? But my thought is, the more you move away from carbon credits, the more you can actually make a stronger claim to your customer base, and the stronger you are in actually moving along the continuum of being more sustainable, of reducing waste, reducing emissions. And it's really reducing emissions as opposed to shifting the emissions somewhere else.
Got it. Excellent. Okay. So follow-up question on the broader Apple and the broader IT market, all whether it's a PC maker or a networking company, et cetera. Are there certain areas where you think Apple and the broader IT market are making progress in their supply chains with sustainability? And then on the flip side, are there certain areas in the IT market where you think technology companies are really struggling to make progress in the supply chain?
I think where they're making progress, I think the actual the modularity of certain products, the design, the materials, and maybe rethinking some of the ways they ship the products. It varies by company. The larger companies have more sway in terms of how they do it, more resources, more expertise in doing it. I think where a lot of companies struggle is missing the real driver of how do you become more sustainable? Because we can spend all of this time on getting materials to be more sustainable, having a perfect plan for a supply chain, and suddenly out of the blue, we get a pandemic, or we get a war, or we get a container ship stuck in the Suez Canal, or we get, and I can go on and on for all of those. Those are all events for disruption. And I think the bigger picture here, or the bigger message here is, unless you're planning closely for managing supply chain risks and disruption, anything you're doing on the sustainability front could be completely wiped away by that disruption. And it could be wiped away because suddenly you're hit with a ton of inventory that nobody needs. That's so much waste. You can be hit now with requests in different places that you have not planned for. And now what do? You go for expedited shipping. How do you go with expedited shipping? Assuming your products allow you to do expedited shipping, you go by air, something that Apple has just moved away from for some of their products. So I think, and I can go on and on in terms of the list of impact disruption has on the supply chain and how that takes us back in terms of the sustainability front, the impact on the environment, the social impact, all of those areas, and what that means to all of us. And the way to do it is understanding that there will be some disruption in your supply chain. We think of risks through the wrong lens. We keep thinking of each event as a black swan event. It's going to happen once in 100 years.
Right.
And sure, that event may not happen soon, but now we think it's going to happen much closer. And I'll give you a few examples. One, again, I just mentioned a few examples of major disruption just in the last 3 years, or 2.5, 3 years. But even we had Hurricane Harvey in Houston, I think in 2017, and I think 2017 or 18, I think 2017. And it had a major impact in terms of the environment, people, and a lot of the disruption. It shut down manufacturing companies. It had a major impact in terms of the environment, sustainability, and so on. So they thinking of that at that point that a hurricane like Harvey would happen also once in 100 years. Right now, the predictions are no, it's once in 30 years, and that might shift. So even those events where we think no, it's not gonna, it's only once in a generation, those are shifting. But even if I agree with you that that's only going to happen once in a generation, what about the other events that have not taken place? And again, we see on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, unfortunately, some of those events that take place. I'll give you one more example, Joe, about some of that disruption, because I think we really need to understand the impact of disruption and the need and the seriousness of understanding how do you connect disruption and resiliency to sustainability, because unless you're doing that, you're working in one track. Again, it's a vertical silo. You're working on some metrics, and something else is coming from out of left field, but it's really something you should have planned for, and it's wiping everything you've planned and worked on. This past summer, and again, this is one more event over the last 3 years. This past summer, there was a drought in Panama. So being in Europe or Asia or Australia, you can think of why do I care about a drought in Panama? It's unfortunate, but why should we care about this? The reason why we all should care about this, and the Federal Reserve was watching this closely, was the drought was impacting some of the lakes, the Gatun lakes in Panama, and that had a direct impact on the water flowing to the Panama Canal. To a point where that depth and levels of the Panama Canal were going to, be lower than they typically are. And the Panama Canal Authority was thinking of getting out they actually had the regulations set up in place. They just were waiting to enforce that based on changes. Luckily, we had some rain come in, so it didn't take effect. But that regulation was going to enforce ships to carry less products. What does that mean? As now transportation costs are going to go up, number of shipments moving back and forth, that's going to increase, which means more emissions. So even if shipping by sea is friendlier to the environment, you still are having more of an impact. That was going to increase the cost of shipping, the cost for folks. That was going to increase the inflation rates. It was going to have a major cascading effect and an impact on everybody's supply chain, to a point where now you're either out of stock and you're trying to expedite shipments, or you have a ton of inventory that's stuck somewhere and you can't do anything about it, and then it goes to waste, and you've just wasted all of that energy and time. So that's why I say disruption is a big part of managing emissions, the impact to the environment, and sustainability. And I think that's where it's a blind spot to a lot of organizations still.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of a little bit is the cybersecurity market, where there's a saying in cybersecurity, assume breach. You should assume that you've been breached. And with supply chains, it sounds like you're saying assume disruption. And by the way, assume that disruption can happen anywhere at any time. What would that mean to your supply chain? Is that a fair way to put it?
It's fair. So one of the areas I also work on is cybersecurity and supply chains, not the
Hmm.
technology part, but the risk and the managing the risk profile. And you're absolutely right. The saying we say is uh, there are two types of companies: those who have been breached and they know it, and those who've been breached and they don't know it. So
Right,
assume
right.
at any point
Yep.
it's going to happen. But what's even critical about that breach is 2/3 of successful breaches happen through a third party.
Yeah. Supply
So
chain.
think of this:
Yeah.
2/3, it's a supply chain. Somebody else in your supply chain is getting breached, and unless I understand how that ecosystem is operating in a full term, and it actually, in some cases, one of my colleagues at the Kogod School of Business and I co-authored the paper looking at this and saying, if you modeling investments, and if you actually spend some resources with some of those critical nodes, some of those weak points, weak links, it makes such a big difference to the security level, and it reduces your actual spend and potential
Hmm.
cost of breach and so on. So to your point, from a sustainability standpoint, two aspects that are very critical. Assume there will be disruption at some point, and how do you quickly manage disruption? Because quickly managing disruption, that reduces your waste, and that lowers the impact of the environment, lowers the social sustainability aspect to it, lowers the economic sustainability aspect to it as well, right? There's those three buckets. And you can only do that by working with all of those critical nodes in your supply chain. And that's
Yeah.
the only way you can do it. It's easier said than done, but I think you need to start with that strategy and mindset in place,
Hmm.
and then proactively working through that.
Got it. Excellent. So, tell me a little bit more about your journey and the research you and the team have been doing over the years. That type of research you've been doing, are you seeing signs of progress, or are you getting a little frustrated with lack of progress? How would you summarize what you've seen overall in your supply chain and the sustainability conversation there?
We definitely see a significant progress than we've had in the last 5 or 10 years. So this is
Okay.
the good news. The bad news, or not bad news, but the other challenging part is we still have a lot of work to be done. But there's
Hmm.
no question we're in a much better position now than we were 5 or 10 years ago. I think the conversation has changed over time. I'll give you an example. We have in the Kogod School of Business, we have a Master's of Science in Sustainability Management program. We've had that for 10 years. So before the topic was even interesting for folks.
Yeah.
Now it's one of the fastest growing programs for us. Now it has an appeal, and that's an indication of the interest of the market. And that interest of the market in that space starts driving the conversation from a policy standpoint, from a business standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, from a risk standpoint. And the only way you can advance sustainability, Joe, is if you're approaching it from all of those aspects together. You cannot look at the environmental piece separately in a silo and not look at the social aspect of this, or the economic or business part and not look at the environmental and social. And they're all interconnected. It's only when we're all looking at all of those pieces together. I see this much more as have advanced over the years now. We're still in a phase, I think. Now you see, again, back to the earlier research I talked about the 4 different segments. In that, we had a lot of folks who were not interested. I think now you see more of an interest, people seeing, in some areas, seeing the value proposition. Some people still need some guidance in terms of where the value proposition is. That has advanced a lot. I think the next phase and the most critical phase is, so how do we do it? So I'm fully on board. I agree 100%. That should be something that's strategic for our organization. Where do we start and how do we start? I think that's where we are now versus 5 or 10 years ago. I think that was still 5 or 10 years ago, but I see a lot of organizations now moving to that side. What has also moved that initiative are some of the regulations and policies, both here but also overseas. Some of the policy in Europe, which looks at
Oh, like CSRD?
the social responsibility, but also I'm trying to think of the law. I'll remember that in a second. But also the Forced Labor Prevention Act here in the United States, which took effect last year, and it practically tells companies you're guilty until you prove your innocence, and you have to go back 5 layers across the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
But that helps. So the question is, how does that help? It helps on the social sustainability aspect, but being able to go and track and trace all of your supply chain nodes, which again, you would think this is it's a very complicated matter, especially as you get to layer 3, layer 4, layer 5 of a global supply chain. As you start getting more visibility and the ability to track and trace, that helps you with managing the environmental piece as well, in terms of emissions, in terms of waste, in terms of looking at, is this a carbon neutral activity? Where we have the emissions, where have we improved, where do we need to improve? So looking at all of those metrics, so that those regulations have really pushed also, in addition to the general discussion and the push from the market side.
Got it. Got it. You answered several questions before I even asked them. So earlier in the conversation, you had mentioned the regulations driving awareness. So you discussed that a bit. You mentioned that consumers now are maybe increasingly expressing an interest in this in terms of as they plan potential purchases, et cetera, and the companies with whom they work. Tell me a little bit more about the consumer aspect of this. Are you seeing an uptick in consumers really being concerned about who they buy from and the types of companies and whether or not they have sustainability strategies that are showing progress?
I think so. To what extent, I think you'll still have two segments: those who are willing to pay a premium to make sure that those are practices in place, and those who really care about this but are not willing or cannot pay that premium. And I think the question is, how do you get that to balance both sides? But I think the combination of that push from the consumer side, in terms of, again, having companies with more responsible practices to the environment, responsible practices to their employees, responsible practices to the society in general, that there has been generally more of a push, and the presence of social media, having that information now fly in split seconds in terms of who's doing what, and trying to have companies be in the forefront of this. I think there's no question there's a push from the market, but also for companies, and I think that's the third segment. So one is the policy driver, one is the consumer driver, one is the organizational driver of understanding this is actually tied to our bottom line. This is not just something for a marketing standpoint. This is not something to appeal to consumers, but it also reduces waste and cost for us. And one of the companies that are also on the forefront of this is Walmart. And it's their recognition. I mean, if you look at Walmart, what the main thing they always advertise is save money, live better, everyday low cost or low price. So it's always about the price and cost. So the only reason they embrace this strategically is that it has to be tied to reduction of cost. And that's where you go back and look at, how do I reduce my returns? How do I reduce my defective products? How do I make sure my suppliers, employees are well trained to reduce defective products? And it's a win-win-win, right? You're improving suppliers' conditions, employees' conditions, reducing the shipments back and forth for waste, and reducing the cost of waste. So it helps on all fronts. But again, it's the giant companies who can take on some of those problems easier than smaller companies. And that's why it's a complicated. So the ones we mentioned were Apple, Walmart.
You're spoiling me, because I had a question about small business, and you're leading me right there. So here, let me paint the picture. You spoke a little bit about the European regulations, right? And then here we're in the US, and we've got the SEC apparently potentially announcing some sort of climate type of policy sometime this month in October. You've got Governor Gavin Newsom in California, who has signed into law a carbon emissions disclosure type of law now. But at first glance, all these policies pertain to big businesses, Walmart and Apple. But on the other hand, you have scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. If you're a small business that's part of these supply chains, aren't you going to get swept up? Don't you have to become more aware of the whole sustainability conversation and what you as a small business can do? Or can you plead ignorance?
as a small business, I don't think anybody now can plead ignorance at some point, because it's going to catch up with you, whether from the consumer side, whether from the policy side, or even from who you're working with. So if you're a small company, but you're part of Walmart's network or Apple's network or another company's network, they're going to require you now, just like the Forced Labor Prevention Act law is, they have to go back and audit those companies and suppliers and make sure that they're moving along. So as a small business and a small company, it's a challenge, and you're going to be struggling with that. And I think that's where, at least again, with the well-established supply or the supply chains where you have a giant company in place, whether it's the Procter & Gamble's, the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Apples, I think that's where the larger companies have to take that driver, the initiative, to support, facilitate, and pave the way for everybody who's on board, or everybody to be on board, whether it's by expertise, by training, by education, by metrics. It's very hard for a smaller company to start learning that on their own, and it sometimes could be prohibitive. And for a larger company, it's in your own interest to make sure everybody's on board, because that's part of your ecosystem. Similar to the cyber risks, it's in your own best interest to have your suppliers well protected, because otherwise you're going to get that damage in place.
Yep. So final question for you. Looking ahead to 2024, how might you see technology product supply chains further evolve with sustainability in mind? Do you see upcoming milestones where you think the companies are going to make some progress here?
I think so. I think we've had some progress in the past. Everybody's talking about AI now, but it's not new AI for climate tracking and climate risk analysis and so on. That has been in place for now. I think that advances even more, and I'll defer to the climate risk experts in terms of how that helps their cases and helps advance their situations. But I think tools and technologies, whether it's AI, analytics, any new platforms of technology, that's great to help with the analysis, with the decision making, with the even the understanding of the complexity of the situation, and where would be the lowest hanging fruit, where would be the biggest impact, right? It's not the level of activity, it's the impact. So where can we actually have the most impact, in what space? Is it a certain product? Is it the transportation element of things, distribution, warehousing? And also the mapping and simulations of risk analysis and modeling of risk, right? We talked about disruption. In the cases of disruption, how would you have your supply chain structured? Should you have more distribution centers in different locations? Should they be closer to customers? Should they not be closer to customers? All of those questions, I think having tools to help and aid, they're not going to solve the problem for us, but they would help us, because I just want to caution people that the technology in itself is not going to fix the solution. It's very complicated. It's very dynamic in place. It's not a static issue. And even our supply chains are not static, which adds a layer of complexity to the situation. But I think having the tools in place really takes care of a lot of the support in terms of at least getting us to a smart decision.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing the expertise with us in terms of what you're seeing in supply chains out there, and as it applies to sustainability. For viewers and readers and listeners who may want to interact with you or reach out to you, is it easy to get a hold of you in the department there?
Sure. My profile is available on the Kogod School of Business's website. They can reach out directly. My profile is there. My email is easy. It's omar@american.edu. Any of those methods are easy. Please feel free to reach out, and happy to have the conversation.
Fantastic. Professor Omar, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Joe, and thank you so much for having me.
This podcast is copyright of Sustainable Tech Partner and Panettieri Ventures. Music written, performed, and copyright of my son, also named Joe Panettieri.